this week and everything. So this is Wolff Week on the Manhattan Network, although it's interspersed with some other things. Welcome very much to Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
And as I did with your dad, I wanted to thank you for that night at the Brecht Forum. It was really enlightening. It was a really good presentation. I thank you for that.
Thanks. I mean, we have a series there, and it was nice to have you and have a lot of people that night. And
It was. It was the highest order of education. I thank you. And let me introduce you and welcome. Welcome very much to Conversations. Pleasure to welcome to the program Max Fraad, is it said?
Fraad.
Fraad Wolff, and he's an economist, and he's also he's involved. He's a general director, I think it is, or general manager of a website and an entity called Global Macroscope.
Global Macroscope.
Global Macroscope, which is very rich and very professional and very well done. I've been at that yesterday. Good deal. And congratulate you. Max, welcome very much to Conversations.
It's great to be here, and I look forward to having some variation of conversation similar to the one we began together at the Brecht Forum, but going in different directions and exploring areas that weren't explored there.
Okay, very good. That's good. And I wonder if you could, it's a template that I use sort of in conversation. We've got 58 minutes, but could you share your background a little bit? I know the Wolff family is eminently qualified in the world of economics. Your dad is a professor.
My father is an economist as well, which I am working toward. I'm finishing a doctoral degree in economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
Right.
And I am a part-time faculty at the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University here in Manhattan, in New York City.
Good.
I also run that website that you've seen, www.globalmacroscope.com. And I do some research for a bunch of different financial companies as well. So I'm busy here and there with the different jobs. I write a regular column in the Asia Times and also at PrudentBear.com. And so mostly I do commentary and research on international financial issues particularly, but economics in general. My graduate degree is at UMass. I finished my undergraduate degree there. I began it at Vassar College here in New York. I grew up mostly in New Haven, Connecticut.
You did your undergraduate degree in what?
At Vassar and at UMass, in economics and history, both.
Economics and history.
Yeah, both. Double major.
They used to call economic history. That's
right.
They used to call it political economy.
Right. I did take a bunch of political economy courses, but mostly I took a bunch of geography also.
Geography, that's what I took my degree in.
Yeah, economic geography courses. Those were, in fact, among the courses I liked the best at Vassar College, with a woman named Carolyn Cartier, who was an amazing teacher.
She was a geographer?
An economic geographer specializing in East Asia. And I loved those classes, and that's kind of what first made me interested in international economics.
We spoke a good deal with your dad about education, educational process, and I always liked geography because I'm sort of interested in everything. I'm interested in patterns between disciplines, and since the computer with linear regression has just galloped into specialization, and geography used to be the queen of the science, or the queen of the disciplines in the 19th century, and that sort of thing. And there are many schools where they don't even have a department anymore because geography is so comprehensive. You can study anything and get away with it in the name of geography. As you said, economic geography, political geography, physical geography. It's the whole earth, and and they thought that it's so comprehensive that it's useless because the only way you can get into something really relevant is to highly specialize in something. What is your thought on that? I mean,
I loved the geography, and I think place and the interactions between the physical landscape and the geostrategic positioning, or where a country sits relative to other countries, tells a lot of vital information and gives you a vital picture into its development, its political successes and failures, the way it can and can't develop economically, and the way it integrates itself into an increasingly globalized world. So I would argue for geography as maybe of growing relevance as opposed to shrinking to understand.
But it is shrinking academically. Harvard doesn't have it anymore. Schools don't even have a department because they say it's covered by everything else in our specialized.
At UMass,
what I'm trying to do is it hardly is there because it's like you can't be interested in everything because you become a jack of all trades, master of none argumentation in terms of academia.
Okay, but the world has big problems, and big problems require a broad view to understand, to discuss, to debate, to research, and to solve. So as much as there's a return to specialization, which economics certainly pushes.
I don't think it's a return. I'm not sure it's a return. I think it's just galloping in the modern experience.
I mean a return more in the economic sense of like a positive return.
I see. I'm sorry.
You know, like you'd get there's a benefit to specialization and the depth of knowledge, but there's a benefit to the breadth of knowledge for relevance, to see the interactions. I mean, if the world is more globalized and integrated than ever, which I would tend to believe, then
ever more so that way.
Sure, then a broad perspective that sees the moving parts and how they connect would be of increasing value and utility.
We don't have a department of everything at a university.
No,
because that would be called absurd. Right?
Yeah, maybe.
Because
I mean, it might be interesting.
You talk to somebody who really understands, like the example I used with your dad was, you get a degree on the use of the pluperfect tense in 13th century French poetry in the south corner of somewhere. And then you become the leading expert in the world in that.
Sure.
And then Bucky Fuller used to be a comprehensivist. Were you in touch with him at all?
No.
I wonder if you have been. He was a comprehensive. Murray Bookchin, they were comprehensive.
Don't know.
Teilhard de Chardin. There were people who were sort of interested in everything. Bucky, I'd suggest you might be interested in him.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. And he was probably more than anybody else at the 60s. You're probably too young to remember that well or anything. But in the 60s, if you were to take all the icons of that era, probably he would be more reminiscent or respected by the people who made up that zeitgeist than any other single human being, I believe. He wrote really interesting books. But he used to talk about education. He had a book, Education Automation. He said that the pirates is the term he used, who run the world.
Right.
They really have to be, they really have to think about everything and they have a comprehensive geopolitical overview. They have to think that way, and they also get good returns on their investments, and they do very well and so
Makes
forth.
sense.
But that they go and they set up graduate schools. And they set up graduate schools so people, and it was a way of divide and conquer, because the best minds coming up, they're thinking comprehensively. The best minds coming up will get so specialized out on their particular thing that they'll never think about the whole and be a threat to the pirates that run the world, who do think about the whole.
Well, look, it makes a certain sense.
You think it does? Yeah.
I mean, on some level, if people's work or their function in the world is not particularly beneficial to the world at large and to other people, maybe whom they care for or care about in some way, intellectually or personally, then probably the best way to keep the system going is to make sure they're specialized so much that they never see the broad effect of their work.
It's called divide and conquer by the British in terms of other cultures and that kind of thing.
Yeah, if you sow the seeds of if you sow the seeds of discord, it's easier to rule a larger group of people as they bother with each other and what have you.
And then they can get all kinds of fights about who's going to be the provost. And there's all kinds of local politics that they can use, too.
That's true.
Because academic politics can be really brutal.
Yeah, I think particularly in this age where academia is not in such great shape and there's a lot of battling among departments for money and there are fewer tenure jobs and they're harder to get. And, in many ways, it's not as good a job as it was a generation ago.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's there's a lot fewer tenure-track jobs. There's a lot more adjunct and part-time work. And so you have a lot of...
Don't forget the graduate assistants
and
that
the
they
graduate
can beat
assistants.
the bejesus out of.
Yeah, I was one for 7 years.
You were one. Right? You know all about that, right?
Yeah,
firsthand. It's like indentured slavery, huh?
Well, it is amazing to be that close to a doctoral degree and be making, $4,000 or $5,000 to teach a course with 20 kids in it. Who are paying a lot of money.
Yeah,
I don't think it does well for the students either, to be honest with you, because they get a lot of people who are stressed out and underpaid and relatively unexperienced. Although I will say that I tried hard, and I know a lot of people did, and I think there are also some very good graduate teaching.
You also come from very good stock, young man.
Well, I'd like to think so.
Your daddy's great, and your mother, I understand, is really fantastic also.
I think so.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm completely objective on that subject. But
probably not.
Probably not. But I would tend to agree with you nonetheless.
Yeah,
sure.
But I had all of that. And I also talked to your dad. I appreciate following up with you and everything. But we talked about the polymath. Another polymath was Isaac Asimov.
Sure, this name I know. I know from the science fiction writing.
Yeah, he wrote a lot of science fiction. But he was a polymath. He was interested in everything.
Right. I think the great minds are. I think the people we respect all throughout the ages, from the ancient Greeks all the way through to modernity, tend to be those with a breadth of interest and a really inclusive set of things they're concerned with. That's even true in economics, a field that's well-deservedly often labeled as overly specialized.
It's also been called the dismal science.
It is. We do even refer to it that way ourselves. It's probably also well-earned, that name. But despite our specialization, if you look at who we really admire, David Ricardo and Adam Smith, Lord Keynes, what have you, Kalecki. You're looking at Schumpeter. You're looking at people who are really pretty broad.
Friedman.
Right, Friedman, whose work absolutely, Milton Friedman, whose work ranges across many fields. Historical, financial, geographical, economic, political science. It's really not the narrow technical stuff that's celebrated so much today in the field, but the breadth of view that we get from them that makes them the enduring great minds of our field.
Okay, of the field. You picked out your Hayek.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Von Mises, Hayek.
Von Mises, yes, that's on another side, and then you got Keynes and all that.
Sure.
You have all that side. Anyway, Isaac Asimov, I did a program with one time years ago and everything, and I looked him up, and he'd written a book on virtually everything in the world. You know, theory, mathematics and astrophysics and everything. There was only one thing, and he did it. He said it on the air. Only one thing that he could not fathom. He could not understand. It was beyond his ken. He just couldn't. He tried. He really tried to get it. And that one discipline that it was beyond him was economics. He could not understand or get his mind around economics.
That may be more our fault than his. I mean, we have an unfortunate reputation as poor writers as a field, and that may have been a complicating factor there. I try to not be a poor writer in my writing, of course, but I've read an awful lot of economics, and I can say that much of the time I thought it was poor, the writing, so it can be a little obtuse. And the way the field has developed, it's developed a lot of specialization and a heavy dependence on mathematics and computer-assisted statistics. And that isn't always the most sort of user-friendly on-ramp for a field. It can be it can be a bit of a problem. So, that tends to turn some people off.
There's a strong tendency to want to turn it into an exact science.
Yes, and is
there not, help me out a little bit if you would, is there such a thing, could there be such a thing as like economic determinism, that economics or a market fundamentalism, maybe you could say, that the market can solve all problems and that it's all seen through the prism of that, and that's been a problem of, as well as other kinds of fundamentalist views of the universe.
Absolutely. I mean, I teach economic development, so I teach the struggles, the successes, and the painful failures of various countries over particularly the last 30 and 50-year periods to increase their standard of living, increase the GDP per capita, increase the life expectancy, increase literacy, increase women's empowerment. And it's a struggle with as many or many more, I'm sad to report, sad than happy endings. And I'd say a big part of the onus for that lies on this market fundamentalism and the economic determinism. So we tend to, as a field, we tend to see way too often everything being controlled by the economic. We tend to have a lot of amateur psychology, which is pre-Freudian in the worst sense, that sees human beings as rats at a feed bar, motivated by prices and incomes in a vacuum. And that's not terribly insightful all the time. And we have a tendency, therefore, to think that economics determines outcomes, that markets and prices get things right.
Everybody makes rational decisions.
Yeah, everyone makes perfect information, complete information, no altruism, and homo economicus, our imaginary person.
And all the externalities and things that, they call them externalities, like the environment and stuff is all beyond the pale or beyond the consideration for a lot of people.
To get this sort of perfect, determinate, optimal outcomes from the free market, we have to make very unrealistic assumptions to limit a model. Then we end up labeling lots of things externalities or external to our model. And what we've done, I think, is we've clinged to a model that looks increasingly absurd at answering.
Absurd.
Yeah, absurd.
Well, the politics is so absurd to me, so might as well be the economic model to be
There may be a relationship between the things if you're comprehensive.
I think there's a tremendous input. The economics mightily informs the political process or the sociological. It's really very, very important in terms of the way the decision-making on the planet operates, and it's not well enough understood by a great number of people. And are the model, do you have moments of, or do we have moments in evolution, like in the evolution of species or evolution of thought or something, where major changes take place in terms of the zeitgeist or the situation which calls for something new? We had 1,000 years after Rome of feudal systems, dynastic states, people got their identity, a feudal system, that kind of thing. And then along came the steam engine, Industrial Revolution, Adam Smith, Ricardo. And then there was a revolution over across the ocean, the United States of America. That informed the Les Miserables of France. They cut off Louis XVI's head and made a revolutionary change. But it was economics, and it was the extension of our consciousness into the environment so we could make the world others. So we make the material world different than in an Eden-like sense as most of the creatures.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that changes in the basic paradigm in economics have global, serious, long-lasting ramifications, and we're living through one now. So we really had a passing of the torch or ascendancy of the neoclassical, the more free market.
Marshall?
Based heavily on based heavily on the work of Ricardo, particularly on international trade, and on Alfred Marshall, comparative advantage-based trade, absolutely. But you had the ascendancy of the neoclassical free market, and the decline, rather precipitous and now quite widespread, of the Keynesian government solves the shortcomings of the market. And in that, you've had a world remade with more open borders, more free trade, many benefits, but many costs, and the real ascendancy of this notion that markets get prices right. Markets do economic planning internally to the extent it's required, allocation, distribution, pricing, reward and punishment in the right way. And that states and state interventions,
they bring all these externalities,
basically cause systemic failures, needless poverty, suboptimal outcomes, lower incomes, lower economic growth, less prosperity, more poor performing asset prices, just you name it, economic malaise writ large. And that paradigm shift has changed the way we run our own economic policy.
You mean by we own the United States?
The United States, where this revolution kind of was home. Here in England, particularly, sometimes called the Anglo-American model or the Washington Consensus. So we and the British are most famous, even more us than the British, but both, for having this sort of free market revolution. On the political side, it's most illustrated by Thatcher and Reagan, but on the economic side, it's pretty fundamental. And that changed our domestic policy, our tax policy, our welfare policy, a lot of profound things, and our interventions around the world through the IMF, the World Bank, the UN development agencies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that all sounds like Keynes, Bretton Woods, those things you ticked off. And the thing is, I can remember I said to your dad, I'm going over the same territory we went with your dad, so you can go look at his thing. But I can remember Mr. Nixon saying we're all Keynesians now. And I asked your father, and I want to get back to the thing where you're ticking off all the indicators of progress, that I would get back to that. But if you were to go and you take the summary of what it is that informs the political leadership or the leadership element in our society, what are we all now in the year 2007 as we were all Keynesians in 1972, according to our president, Mr. Nixon, with many nodding heads shaking, yes, that was the case? And so
I think
what are we all now?
I think our government policies still run according in many ways to a Keynesian theory, but nobody much says they're Keynesian in a position of authority. The Council of Economic Advisors would certainly, quite honestly, not describe themselves these days as Keynesians, and they shouldn't, they're not. So we're neoclassicals now. If we were once Keynesians, to the extent there's a we, and there isn't lots of diversity, which there is, we'd be neoclassicals now. Much more than Keynesians. We believe in the free market, make solutions, and the government makes problems, which is a bit the mirror image of a Keynesian worldview, where the government is the best solution to the inherent failings of a market. As opposed to
as we had suffered in the Depression.
Well, yeah, after the Great Depression, telling people that markets self-correct and were absolutely reliable.
It was a hard sell.
No, I think it was beyond a hard sell. It was probably a short trip to retirement. If you were lucky, you'd be voted out of office, and otherwise, your head might be displayed on a pole. And so it obviously wasn't very politically viable at the time, and it went to a long abeyance, a long period of decline from the late 20s, early 30s, all the way through the late 60s, early 70s, and then the oil shocks and the global recession, which begins the recessionary environment in the late 60s, and the 73 oil shocks, absolutely. And you have a global recession. Hits the United States somewhat particularly hard, because from 1945 to late 60s, the United States was, half the world economy, totally dominant in every product category. And by the late 60s, early 70s, our oil dependence makes us vulnerable when the oil prices shoot up. And Europe and East Asia, mostly Japan at that point, have rebuilt. So now there's competition. You're not the only guy on the block. It was the first step in what we're now seeing now as the second step of the decline of U.S. dominance in the global economy. And it caused anger and suspicion and kind of a search for new understandings in the 70s, a little bit the way it looks like it may be beginning to again, and maybe began after 9/11 here in the U.S. This idea that we're not invulnerable, we're not dominant, we're not the only guy on the block, and we now have to readjust and be competitive in a world where being arrogant and self-assured of your dominance is a potentially fatal mistake.
Well, we had gotten such prominence out of the Second War because everybody else was in ruin. I mean, Europe was all in ruin, and there was a lot of ruin out in the east part of the world, the Asian part of the world. So we were sort of the only game in town in a certain sort of sense. And then that changed and everything.
Sure. I mean, the only place where we had sort of fighting in the U.S. was Hawaii, which wasn't even a state at the time.
Right.
And so basically, our major, viable, advanced capitalist economic competitors were somewhere between mostly and totally destroyed. And then we worked on the rebuilding with the Marshall Plan and what have you.
Marshall Plan was a great idea.
It was a great idea. And the results are, partially a great competitor now in Europe, but partially a success of rebuilding the Western world after a cataclysmic series of wars, particularly the latter, but the World War I and World War II, which were mass killing and mass destruction.
Just absurd.
On a horrifying scale.
Yeah, they had I saw a thing one time where the turned 19th century, the beginning of 19th to 20th century, and then now, that the rate of, or maybe the rate of the number of civilians that were killed according to the rate of the young men in the meadow fighting in the old traditional way, it had been something like 9 to 1. That'd be 9 soldiers for every 1 civilian, and that thing had changed from 9, the exact opposite. 1 soldier for every 9 civilians that are killed when firebombing and so forth by the end of the 20th century. Big change, big shift.
Well, unfortunately, the sort of fascist invention of civilian bombing has caught on and been embraced by all major military powers now.
You said the fascist invention?
Well, I mean, they were, they were some of the early people to self-consciously bomb civilians.
It took Guernica to get Picasso to fight. It took the bombing to get Picasso to paint a political thing.
Yeah. I mean, it was a great trauma, and to see it, I mean, it had been used actually somewhat, unfortunately, quite a bit in the developing world, the sort of what they called gunboat diplomacy, where shelling and occasionally anti-civilian mass military campaigns were not uncommon against, they were here against Native Americans.
Well, the bombing at Dresden was sort of along that line, too.
The firebombing at Dresden killed more people than Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
There were more people killed by the firebombing of Tokyo before the drop on Hiroshima than there were in that drop. I mean, firebombing was horrible.
Absolutely.
You read Vonnegut, he just passed, unfortunately, about Dresden or other cities too. And we were protected in our impotence, in a sense, compared to where we've gone since the Second World War. We now have weapon systems that, if they were to be unleashed in a spasm of hatred that was manifest. First World War, guns of August, all kinds of alliances, they interlinked. You couldn't see unexpected consequences of things like a Duke being shot down or something, some crazy thing. If they were to be unleashed, it would mean apparently the end of our species for the first time. That's what they model. That's what they tell us. Do you think that's true?
If you had a full-scale thermonuclear confrontation?
Yes.
If the human race survived, I think, in the best modeling, it would be under horrible and irrecognizably different circumstances.
Did a thing with a physicist who developed string theory and also worked with Teller and everything. He said, without a doubt, there are systems that exist now, not inflection points of ideas or something like that, or what could be projected maybe, but a higher trigger alert there that if they were unleashed, it would mean now the end of our species. And we couldn't do that in the Second World War.
No.
Within our own lifetime.
And also the biological weapon systems that are out there are pretty frightening too.
The people who are aware of that, so that's an existential new condition in the universe compared to our Homo sapien line. We're in a new situation that's there.
We have the technical capability to destroy ourselves as a species and many other species.
For the first time.
Right, for the first time.
We couldn't do it. We crossed the line about 1970.
Okay.
Crossed that line where we could destroy the weapons. And Fuller and others who modeled whether or not the basis of economics, which is sometimes characterized as the allocation of scarce resources. He took a measurement. I gave you the chart you can take home with you and so forth at one time. And he measured along the lines that you were ticking off when you said you're taking about population trends, and you were talking about
the standard sort of measures.
Standard measures of measuring
well-being.
Reality, in a sense. You're talking about population trends, new materials, technology, this kind of thing. Those kind of things. He did all of that sort of thing in a non-ideologically larded way, which I presume you're doing in terms of research, or your people were putting that, thing together in a pattern-recognizing way. He did it, and he called it World Game. And they're putting all these resources together, and they projected the reality of the world without ideology. In a way. And he came to the conclusion that we were... major premise. Through the technological extension of our consciousness, there are because of the technology and the increased productiveness of the technology, a higher percentage of the world population can be realistically seen to be haves if you measure have, have-not. You have to get a definition of that through time. Do you think that's true?
Yeah. I mean, I think
you think it is true? There's progress along that.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways. I think that
a higher percentage through time.
I mean, it's hard to know what makes well-being.
Can be yes. Well, you'd have to get a definition.
Right, and that's a difficult thing to do.
And somebody could say, "Hell, I'm not really."
Well, everybody could say,
I don't have a mansion. I don't have a swimming pool full of diamonds yet because I'm not rich. You know, but you have to come to some kind of.
Rich is a relative term as much as absolute.
What I'm saying?
I do, but I think Bradford DeLong has done a good job with that, and I think you can show that over time, the basic material standard of living enjoyed by the basic resident of Earth has improved markedly since the Industrial Revolution.
And if you took that into account, you could come to an agree. You'd have to come to it within. Models are hard to set up and so forth, particularly comprehensive models. You set up a model, you could get up a thing where you could measure. Let's say you got 6 billion people or so. We had so many, and so you could measure the population, the trends, and so forth, and you could put on a graph, simple graph, what percentage of the world population could be realistically be seen to be haves as opposed to have-nots.
Right.
Could you not?
You could. I think the haves, depending on what you do, what they have to be haves.
Yeah.
If you mean real financial wealth, it's a tiny number of people.
Yeah, yeah.
If you mean food security, it's a much larger number of people.
Yeah.
If you mean access to some basic literacy or something like that, it's a larger number. I mean, if you look at the criteria, some of the best of the criteria by Sen, the Nobel laureate Sen, and you're looking there as development as freedom, the very famous notion, which I think is compelling, that maybe part of what in economic development or enriching people does is giving them more choices and more capabilities, then I think that the general situation of a lot of people is in absolute terms infinitely better than it was 500 years ago.
You got, no doubt, not only 500 years ago,
or 200 years ago.
You could do it. Fuller saw it just coming almost, it's becoming hyperbolic certainly, but it's coming almost exponential now. In terms of the thing is it's like a quickening. It's happening more and more. He said we'd reached a point where in his reckoning 10% were haves. Oh no, this is not the situation. You make another distinction.
Right.
You make a distinction between, in a certain sense, that idea we could blow up the whole bloody world, the whole planet. We could, no, the whole species.
Right.
That's new, but that can't be tested.
Well, I mean unfortunately,
I don't think it's a good idea.
It's not a repeatable test.
So it's only, yeah, that's right. So you can't, it's got to be modeled or something. So what you're talking about is a capability.
Right.
Now, there's a difference between a capability and actual reality.
Sure, huge.
And usually you have a certain kind of thing. Like business, you make an investment that's going to pay for itself out of its future earnings, or else it's a bad business thing. You know, it's a projection and that sort of thing. But you can have a capability that is available to you that historically was not available. When we got the steam engine, all kinds of things opened up in terms of that.
Or jet engine and the
new things. So you
internet. I mean, you can make an argument about the internet or cellular telephony.
Look at that damn thing. There used to be a room this size with vacuum tubes to get 1 megabyte of content. Now you're running a thing, and they're now talking about terabytes.
Right.
They're going to be terabyte computers and terabyte chips. I mean, it's incredible. But the point being is you have a capability, and then you have an inherited system. This is always the thing. You have to amortize the old system in a sense. You have an inherited system that is superseded, Schumpeter notwithstanding, with creative entrepreneurialism. You have a system that has to be amortized. You have an inherited system, let's say, and that goes into sociological memes and thinking and all kinds of things, a whole pattern by which things operate that is out of date with what the future allows in a new kind of way. And that's a dynamic that's one that is try to be if you can understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
I think
our ideas
won't allow you to realize.
Yeah, I think our ideas and our ability to fully exploit new technologies, new inventions, new capabilities, and new possibilities lags those new possibilities. So our new possibilities, it takes a while for us to figure out what they are, how to make sense of them, how to use them, how to agree on the distribution or the utilization of these new technologies and capabilities. And there can be lots of fighting, and there can be forces of regression.
I've noticed
that don't much want to embrace the new technologies, or a sort of Luddite impulse that's frightened of them. And I think we have all that. Yeah, we have all through the ages, but now too.
All through the ages now too. Yeah. One of the things that if you take your chart and you say, great, suppose you come to it in your model. Mr. Fuller did, others did, and others have, Bookchin and others, but and you go and you say, okay, percentage of the world population. That's what he did.
Right.
Or halves. He had energy slave coefficients and everything. You could test the model. You could test the criteria by which you do that and everything. But the trend is that a higher percentage of the world population are able to be seen as haves in terms of our capability through time.
I think
that's a trend.
I think I would believe that. Sure.
That a pattern recognizing thing could do. Once you've got that, it's just a matter of time when we cross the 50% mark, where there are
except for that you don't run in just one direction.
Go ahead, talk.
History is never just unidirectional, right? Movement through time, it's not always just an unfettered, no reversals pass forward. There's also reversals.
Yeah.
So there's periods where the total wealth and the distribution of wealth runs the wrong way.
Okay.
So it's not just linear.
Yeah, but we understand that. But the thing is that the trend, so that the line will be a little wiggly, but the trend is going. The line is going like that.
I think unambiguously.
And that you would get on one side haves,
right,
and you get on the other side have-nots. So you had a certain percentage of the world as are haves.
Right.
The other side of the thing are have-nots.
Sure.
It's always been throughout all of human history, if you measure it by some reasonable terms,
right,
overwhelmingly more have-nots than haves.
I would say that's probably true, yeah.
And that the trend is that we're getting to be where we have a capability for more and more of the world population to be haves in terms of our abstract, technologically augmented capability to produce.
I would agree, but I would also think that for most of human history, the difference between haves and have-nots materially is very small. And what's happened is the average person is doing better than they were 50, 60, 100, 200 years ago, but the difference between haves and have-nots is amazingly large. And even even the discussion that we're having about haves versus have-nots, this discussion is informed by our age, in which there is so much, and it's distributed somewhat unequally that you can massively unequally, that you can begin to look at the sort of haves and have-nots. Because, half the world's population for material wealth is in the zero range.
What does that mean?
So about 3 billion people have virtually no tangible wealth.
None, yeah.
Right.
I saw
very low incomes, over 1 billion people living on less than $1 a day.
How in the hell can you live on less than $1 a day?
Well, they're not living in a sort of...
How can anybody live anything like near their potential, much less even their own biography even, on $1 a day?
You cannot live up to your potential very easily on $1 a day. There are more developed economies, more monetized, more modernized, more market like ours, have many more economic transactions. So some of those very, very low incomes are slightly exaggerated. Not that those people's poverty is, but the income is exaggerated down because we have a conception of life which, with all of our exchanges and interactions going through a market and being measured in dollar terms, and in much less developed regions, that's much less common. So there's more barter and more living off nature and exchange and informal arrangement than there would be in a place like New York City. But you can't really realize your potential
on
$1 a day for most people most of the time.
Yeah, well, most of the time it's been brutish and short. And it's and James Joyce's line, history is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken might be relevant to a modern consciousness. But if we got that concept that you got a higher percentage of the world population
in absolute
can realistically
terms,
be seen to be haves as compared to what they were out of the historical trend,
then
you reach a point where you cross that line. Let's say this reflects reality in a way. There's going to be, it's never perfect. But there will be a time then when you would cross the 50% mark. You would have had 10% of the population were haves only, and then potentially, and then it would be 20, then it would be 30, it would be 40.
Right. Unless we change what it means to be a have.
Well, you have to get a definition.
It's a moving target for have, then that changes.
You'd have to get a reasonable definition of what the hell we mean by that. That's a definition of terms that can be argued. But to set up the model, you have to set the model right. But the point is, you got a trend going there, and that we would get a point where we would cross the line where 50% of the world could be realistically be seen now to be haves in terms of our capability. And that fuller hell, we crossed that line about 1970.
Okay.
And that if you cross that line, then you could, is it realistically to say, because we left out Marx when we talked about, I think, but he was sort of a big force in Europe and China and whatnot. But you would cross that line. You could say that we were transcend. Is it possible? I've seen definitions of economics as the allocation of scarce resources.
Well, the economy's job is to...
If we cross that line of 50%, more than 50%, and then the trend is going. And the trend is picking up beyond hyperbolic, almost exponential, let's just say. That we will or have ever, in a realistically meaningful way, transcend scarcity as an ontologic reality.
Or is that not the way we define scarcity in economics, but other definitions of scarcity
No,
because in economics we have
economics. I'm talking about
in the formal discipline.
Political economics, or historical economics.
Yeah.
You know, a comprehensive
Sure.
understanding of the human condition.
I understand. I think in a common usage term of scarcity, you could make arguments that significant portions of the world's population, with the innovation and the productivity of modern industry, have already left extreme scarcity behind in their memory.
You're fudging.
But the way we do scarcity in economics,
extreme scarcity.
But the way scarcity is defined. Okay, the way we
define
define scarcity in economics, though, is that there's a limited amount of material wealth, and human desire is limitless. So long as you define it that way, there's no escape from scarcity.
That's right. Then and it would be very inconvenient if you are to our models that we inherited out of history. If all of history we were in a condition of scarcity, and we find ourselves now in a situation that the laws of scarcity, or the ontology, the resistance, the reality, is no longer one in which the historical inherited institutions and thought patterns were formulated, and we were in a new zeitgeist, or a new reality. And people wouldn't be able to catch up with that, and that seems to be what we're in.
Yeah,
we have a capability, because the adverse side of destroying the whole damn species is we have a capability of providing overwhelmingly, in terms of the supply side, of what we're capable of doing, and we don't have a system that makes it possible for us to do that for the vast majority of the population of the world.
Yeah, we are able to produce a material standard of living that's amazing.
For everybody.
Yeah, for everybody at this point.
And with externalities.
With enormous ecological damage and non-renewable resource issues, and climate change issues.
Our institutions, the political institutions, do not allow us to form the capital or distribute the buying power to the people adequately, because we're doing it all within models that were formulated and assume scarcity when that's no longer true in terms of the reality. Is that a possibility, or is that
I think that may be one contributing factor. It's not absurd. There may be one contributing. That may be one.
If it isn't absurd, it's the most important question confronting the human society. And why don't our leadership, or our elements, or our academic economists come up with models that would take that into account? We've transcended scarcity as a bullet point.
Okay. I think the idea being that most of our models, at least orthodox, non-heterodox economics, if you work in the neoclassical tradition with that assumption set and those basic models, then we assume something called non-satiation. Right, so you can never.
That's assuming non-scarcity. I mean, that's assuming
assumption. Right. So
yeah, but that's by definition. That's a tautology. I mean, that's a tautology.
It is tautological. Yeah. It is absolutely.
But
that argument is made, okay, and sometimes made a version of it somewhat different, but not wholly different. Even by a guy named Bradford DeLong, who does good work out of University of California, Berkeley, and his argument is only that if you take a very basic understanding of what people need, then you can see an absolutely beautiful dance of modern industry and industrial revolution, taking care of those basic needs for a larger and larger and larger and larger portion of the human race.
Security, like Social
moving
Security.
Forward. A minimum income guarantee, you mean?
Well, okay, or some sort of, like Social Security, that's another thing you kind of, those are fun. That's part of the investment portfolio of the nation, isn't it? They're invested somewhere. They must be very low risk, because the system, I don't understand exactly.
A lot of them are in special treasury bonds.
But couldn't they, treasury bonds and low risk and everything, the trust fund and everything, but couldn't they set up a system where you have some sort of insurance against casualty insurance against loss or so forth, so that you up the scale to which they can go with responsible policy that serves the people, like Social Security does. In a way, it can't be a crapshoot like Wall Street, but go up the risk scale larger by maybe reinsuring loss or something like that, so that the Social Security thing can go up further into the risk thing, and then distribute income to the mass of the people without all the, like Social Security does.
Sure, you could have social insurance against illness. I mean, state health care is sort of social insurance against illness, I would argue, in any case. You could have it against, traffic accidents, personal accidents, unemployment. That's kind of the idea behind unemployment insurance.
You could raise that all the time.
And Social Security is a two-part.
It's like risking the risk. You'd be
lowering the risk.
You're lowering the risk, and as you lower the risk, you can go into higher and higher aspects of the economy that are now, some of them are thought of as venture or something. But they formulate everything as being a venture thing, where it's a big crapshoot.
Right.
And that's not an adequate model for a world, particularly if Mr. Keynes said the technology is displacing labor, and we distribute all income through labor. We're all wage slaves within a system where the assets are all owned by small groups.
Not all. Some people make their income off ownership of capital.
Not very many.
No.
It's just a well, there's some people made their ownership off my liege lords in feudal system. There were a few people, or emperors. They made their thing off something other
tribute payments or something.
Tribute payments. Yeah, they had these kind of models that there's always a group who ruled. We have finance people who rule. They own everything, but we're all picking up leaves on their estate.
Right.
In a way. So we live in a slave system. Marxists would call it a wage slave system that we live in. And
or a system in which the division of the returns from the wealth production in this society are tilted toward ownership of wealth and away from labor. And actually that
the input to production is less and less labor.
Well, the inputs to production
in
terms of the value, I mean, there are a lot more people employed in the world now than there were 100 years ago. A lot more people in the world, period.
Yeah, but the theoretical basis, it's all based upon, I mean, the Employment Act of 1946 is our basic policy grounding statement in the United States, and it's applicable to the world, that the income to the people is going to be distributed through what we call a labor criteria or job.
Right, sure.
That's
most
the way
people,
what
most people have to make money on is to sell their mental and physical ability to produce wealth.
And because in the sense where the technology is more and more important, something other than labor is important. Automation's coming. Lord Keynes said we're going to have massive technological displacement of labor in the productive process. And those assets are all owned by a mighty group. And the masses don't have any ownership as a means of distributing income. We don't have a system of simulfinance where you build demand to the supply, the capital formation and the supply. We don't have a system that's adequate that lets us do what we're capable of doing. There's a lot of unutilized productive capability.
There's certainly a lot of unutilized productive capability.
Why? Is it the fault of the economists?
Oh,
or is it the fault of the economist?
Maybe you shouldn't ask an economist.
I know. Well, I mean, you got to blame somebody.
Sure. I would prefer not to blame the economist.
Have you ever seen a book for blame? We got a place to blame somewhere, right? We got to blame somebody for this mess.
But I would also distinguish the economists tend to be the ones who study the economy, not the ones who necessarily make the economic decisions.
Yeah, but they inform the
political process. They absolutely inform them, and some of what goes wrong economically is unambiguously the fault of economics and economists. But it's shared. It's shared.
Yeah, there's other villains to go around, but you got to.
Sure, we're not in a vacuum making the decisions.
No, but my grandmother came from Edinburgh, so Scott, and there's a fellow Herman.
Like Adam Smith was also from Edinburgh, also Scottish.
Not only that, there's a fellow Herman, serious economist, a serious historian. It's hard to get the doctor. Everybody should be a public intellectual, or But anyway, he wrote a book, and it's really interesting, well researched, really interesting. He said how the Scots invented the modern world. And everything in it. So if we're going to look at the modern world with all its groans and benefits and everything, it's the Scots. It was the Scottish Enlightenment. Hume,
so we can blame the Scots instead of the economists.
Absolutely, and I'm a Scot, you see. So if you're a Scottish economist, you're in deep doo-doo.
Yeah.
60% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence in the colonies were Scots.
Yeah, I can believe it.
And it was the Scottish Enlightenment. So it's the Scots who invented the institutions of that make up what we call modern world.
Sure.
Which is out of sync with what the future requires, perhaps.
Always, but that just means there's going to be change. Closing the gap between where we are and where we will be is the process of change and evolution and development, and that's what makes life interesting, if a little bit unpredictable and sometimes disappointing. Yeah. That's the human journey on some level, right?
The human journey is maybe going to come to an end. I mean,
it is possible.
It could not be said. 200,000 years we've been here, and it's never been able to do that. There would always be a survivor on the other side of the world when you took the grain and stole it from somebody or whatever.
Sure.
The Dons did. The Mafia Don. But now it means we're at an existential new thing. And more challenging is this thing that we may have transcended scarcity.
Okay.
Now, wait a minute. On a system scale.
It's hard to say we've transcended scarcity in a world where, but also in a world where 1.5 billion people face what looks to me, as a serious scarcity problem on an everyday basis. Yeah. And scarcity is also, I believe scarcity is socially determined. I believe that there are hundreds of thousands of people in New York City who face chronic, stress-inducing, health-reducing, panic, mental illness-creating scarcity every day. Right? So it depends on what you mean. I mean,
No, Max, if I may. I'm not talking about the reality.
Okay.
I'm not talking about the everyday reality. I'm talking about the
possibility.
Capability.
Okay, yeah.
That's the thing. We have a there are people under all kinds of stress and everything, but they needn't be. It's just that we're enthralled to outdated institutions that the economists call what is necessary in order to the way the economy is going to be set up by the people who run the world. They are out of touch. We don't have vision what the future requires to bring liberation, perhaps, or qualitative transformation in the human condition.
That very well may be true.
Do you think it could be?
Yeah, I think. Look, I think.
Why is it never ever brought up in any place?
Well, it's a dicey subject.
I suppose so. It is.
It's a dicey subject, and it offers a bit of an indictment of a whole lot of fields and of the political and economic institutions and arrangements that we have in the society. Right?
Outside of that, it's perfectly benign.
Yeah, but that's a fairly large series of obstacles and opponents to take on. Not to say it's not worth doing, but it would be a fairly large. Yeah, do I believe that on some level we've developed capabilities, technological and productive, to the extent where we could do a whole lot better, which I know at least we can agree on, at meeting a lot more people's basic needs? Absolutely.
Well, it's qualitatively different than the historical context and the institutions. We got a commitment to outdated institutions.
That's always true. I mean, I'm sure that's true. That's always true.
It's like amortizing old technologies or something, you know.
Okay, we're still paying off principal on technologies that are now redundant or outdated.
Yeah. We don't have a system. We don't have vision.
Right.
Collectively.
Okay.
For what the future requires if we're going to avoid destroying the whole bloody thing, because the system that we're heading for now is leading to, everybody's getting atomic bombs, everybody's getting things, there's hatreds are growing.
Yeah, it does look like there's a bit of a race for atomic weapons these days.
And our intellectual community's falling down on the job in terms of providing an alternative vision that would be a pattern recognizing capability of these things, rather than all the specializations that say nothing needs to be done, everything's okay, we'll muddle through, or that it's too complicated, or it could be quantified this way or something. What I'm saying is, where are the sources of vision which the future requires on a planetary system scale for the whole of the planet within the broader pattern of the evolution of universal consciousness?
But I think the world is also being pulled and pushed in multiple directions at any given time. So if you look at, say, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals,
they haven't been met very well.
They have not been met very well, but that's a real effort to remove the worst forms of scarcity and want from a significant portion of the most afflicted populations on Earth.
Well,
those 8 goals, those 7, 8 goals.
Yeah, the goals are there, but the means to do it are not.
Well, the means to do it are there, but the basic wealthy country governments and the parties have not made good on the full funding of their commitments that they made there at the conference. And progress toward those goals has been lackluster and disappointing, and painfully so.
Right.
But you also have coming together, you have the enlargement of the European Union, an attempt to really integrate an area that produced the 2 great, wasting wars of modernity into an area that would hopefully be free of warfare, with economic cooperation and a basic economic prosperity spread even into the areas of the East that emerged in the last 15 or 20 years as much poorer than their Western neighbors.
You think they can all continue, because they all do, they all continue to distribute income to the masses through labor?
Yeah, although Western Europeans more than Americans have basic income guarantees.
Western Europeans are more that way, a little bit that way, but on the whole, it's still, all of our economic theory is predicated upon the labor theory of value that is
the labor theory of value is explicitly rejected by neoclassical economics.
Okay, talk to it.
I mean, the labor theory of value is absolutely the guiding principle of classical economics before Marx. A different kind of labor theory of value guides the work of Marxian economics. But then you have this thing, the marginal revolution, with Menger and Walras and Jevons and such in the 1860s, 1870s.
Okay, that's all new to me.
And,
go ahead.
And that's modern, the ascendant modern theory, neoclassical economic theory, is not based on a labor theory of value. The idea there is that both labor and capital make a contribution to the product, the final value of any good or service produced, and each is paid according exactly to their contribution.
Oh, great.
So capital and labor each receive a wage, right? The return to capital being capital's wage, the wage, the same term, is labor's wage, and that exhausts the total product. There is no economic profit.
Well, that would be true, because that's all there is.
But there is no there's no profit.
That would be a
well, the big argument comes about whether or not that's true, because there might be profit. In that model, there's no economic profit. Okay, so in the long run, there's perfect competition. There's no economic profit. They will use something called Euler's theorem, Euler's theorem, which is product exhaustion. And the idea here is that there's not a labor theory of value, that the combination by the entrepreneur of capital and labor. Yeah, Schumpeter is very much interested in that. The combination.
He's sort of in the saddle along with Mr. Friedman now?
Well, I think they would be seen as seeing the economy somewhat differently, but there are similarities.
Between those two, right?
Yeah, I mean, they tend to draw fans from different political and economic constituencies, but they're both major.
Neocons are Friedmanites by and large, right?
I don't know. Neocons tend to be much more interested in government policy than Milton Friedman was.
Those things, we want to have those things blended, don't we? We don't want to get it all specialized out. We want to have something that begins to have some sort of resonance between the political, economic, historical, comprehensive vision thing.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, on some level you'd want to see an integration. Yeah. But modern neoclassical economics does not believe in a labor theory of value as such.
Okay, well, the way you laid it out, you got that other thing. You said labor is going to get... But the overwhelming production, it's a matter of figures, right? But the major source of production, that trend about the non-scarcity, or the trend of haves and so forth. Another one is the input to production, labor, let's just say, on one side and everything else on the other. Okay. And in Tom Jefferson's day, probably 90% of the source of production, no mass production, no nothing. You had a hatchet to cut down a tree, and you had a piece of, and 10% maybe was something other than labor, and those trends probably have reversed. That probably 85% of the production is something other than labor, and we're going to distribute all income by national policy to the masses of the people through labor. Yeah. So it's out of sync, and then what we do, we have to tax, and capital is the assets are owned by a small group of people, and they're being ripped off. The capitalists are being ripped off because they don't get the full return on the productive value that their capital represents through taxes and that kind of thing.
Presumably, even if you do pay taxes, either as an employer or an employee, you also get something from the federal government, an education system, roads, a national defense system, science research, blah, 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 you know, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. We don't get no benefit from the government. Things there, there are some things that we get as citizens, whether we're corporate citizens or individual citizens, from our tax revenues that are collected by the federal, state, local government. So
but is it appropriate that we're going to distribute all income to the masses of the people? I mean, the capital assets are all going to be owned by a small group. Krugman had a piece in the newspaper, I don't know if you tracked it, he said that the growth in the last 3 or 5 years, it didn't even go, the growth beyond inflation, didn't even go to the upper 5 or the upper 1%, it didn't even go to the upper 1/10 of 1%. There was some
really
growth
has been stilted.
It went to the 100th of 1% is where the growth all went.
Well, your point is particularly good right now. The last 30 years in the United States, the basic return to
that's
a bad distribution of income. Yeah, it's a terrible distribution of income. And so the last 30 years, our distribution of income has gotten a lot worse.
They set the template. They got all the money. They set the template, and we're all picking up leaves on their estate, and why do we put up with it?
Yeah, that's probably the $64,000 question. I mean, I know when I was born in the mid-1970s, I was born into what had the best distribution, the most equal distribution of income of any developed country in the world. Yeah. And I now, as a 30-year-old man, live in the country with the worst distribution of income.
Worse than France, 1789.
Yeah, worse than everybody else. No, not 1789.
Yes, it
worse
is.
than France today.
No, worse than France in 1789, the disparity of income.
Perhaps the disparity of income, the disparity of wealth.
Okay, sure. Okay.
And basically,
I bet income, wealth also.
Wealth is always less equally distributed than income.
Of course.
But the distribution of wealth and income in the United States has gotten much, much, much less fair the last 30 years, and it's gotten much worse radically fast the last 6 or 7 years because the return to assets, speculative assets, homes, stocks, bonds, commodities, oil, etc., hedge fund, alternative investments, have been running at a clip much more rapid, and profits too, than wages, which are stagnant to downtrending.
They're going to be downtrending. Yeah, we're going to talk with Ushel. What's his name? Louis
Uchitel.
Yeah, we're doing a program with him. He said they're outsourcing. They're outsourcing the jobs. The jobs are going down here, and they're going to go up and take slave labor there and everything. But the point being, beyond all that outsourcing and all that stuff, is Mr. Keynes, labor is going to be displaced in the productive process by technological instruments, and the technological instruments are all owned by a tiny group, and there's no way for the people to own the technological instruments because the way of capital formation can't let them in on it. They have no collateral, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The difference is there. You have no way to distribute income other than through wages, and the wages are going to be, the ability to get wages are going to be undercut massively by technological displacement. We're in for trouble beyond outsourcing.
Yeah, well, we're in for a troubled distribution of wealth and income, which we have.
We need some sort of a new economics.
I think we know there are other ways of organizing the economy. I'm not sure it's a failure of imagination or if it's a failure of policy and planning.
But it is a failure.
But there are systematic failures,
or
absolutely.
There's a breakdown in what we need. We don't have a vision.
If the task of our economy and our polity working together is to create anything like an equal distribution of wealth, then we are a royal failure that's failing greater and greater in each passing year.
Not even just equality in the name of justice or something, but it's so frigging inefficient. It's so inefficient when you don't have a system, because you're saying with all this economic, you got all kinds of commitments out of the past. It's like feudalism thought that they were there, the Ancient regime.
Right.
They thought they had an Ancient regime that was forever.
Sure.
And then there was a change. We think we have an Ancient regime with our International Monetary Fund and all the system and all our economic theory and everything, and it's out of date with what's required. We need something new that the future requires, and it's not forthcoming from the intellectual community. They're falling down on the job.
Could be.
I mean, I would suggest.
Yeah.
You know, one country I think might be is Libya.
I don't know much about Libya.
Libya is they may be to the modern world the way the United States of America was to the French feudal system or the royal systems of Europe. As a model that is thought of as being out of date, because you go there, you start a business, you can't hire anybody. They're trying to get rid of the income distribution by labor criteria,
right,
and make them all owners of it. And that might be an advance in a system in terms of the...
Yeah, I'm really unfamiliar with the economics of
But the rest of the world is all tied up with this outdated model that came from the United States 230 years ago. And we think
wage labor doesn't just come from the United States, I mean, it's older. I mean, the British and parts of modern Belgium and Holland and stuff had a wage system before we did in many ways. I mean, we were a nation of small farmers well into the British and Dutch Industrial Revolution.
But we sort of inherited that along with
we did become the keepers of the torch, and we did run it forward, especially the last 60, 70 years. We were the lead runner there.
We do have a sense that we represent historical legitimacy. Yes. Our system, our republic system, where you vote, and the politics and the economic institutions, and we are the legitimate march of history. We're legitimate.
But most of that's short-sighted arrogance, and it never had a very good story. It's when you're most powerful, you can decide that you're the standard of civilization. Everything else should be measured against you, and you're the best. I mean, but that's pure arrogance.
But they've done that. Marx tried the thing in Russia. That fell apart and imploded, so then the arrogance got even larger. Then China got co-opted, and they're still going down the line. And we're still saying we're legitimate, but what we should be looking for are models other than that, which we're trying to advance as legitimate, because we're as outdated as Louis XVI's Versailles Court.
Well, you look at it, it's also true.
Requires.
Look, if
you
don't,
think it's possible?
Yeah, that's possible.
Where's the vision going to come from, and what are happening with the intellectual?
My assumption is that when people become fed up with one system, they'll discover new and old ideas that are different the way they always have.
Who's discovering it? Where is the inspiration? That's what I'm saying.
People have to be pretty fed up with their present situation to even begin the search.
I think a lot of people are fed up, don't you?
I don't think they're fed up in the way that you're suggesting. They're fed up with all kinds of things. They're not happy with their taxes. They know their wages are too low. They wish their children had better opportunities and went to better schools at lower prices. They wish that we didn't face the environmental problems that we do, or they're upset about skyrocketing tuition costs or gas prices. But it's much more focused and individual. It's probably less systemic, and it's less. I don't feel, but I don't know. I don't feel a general public at this particular moment feeling an organized desire to push or change the basic economic system in this country. I have no particular insight. I could easily be wrong. I don't know.
I don't think there were many people at the court of Versailles along about 1780 who thought there was any reason to change anything, because they were all doing very well.
The ones in the court, but the other 99% of the society.
Well, there were some people out there that were, and a lot of the people are very much against what's going on now in the world. There might be something, revolution blowing in the wind, maybe.
It's quite possible, or it could be fed off into all kinds of movements and undertakings which aren't so nice.
Could be co-opted. So it could be very dangerous.
It could be very angry. It could be very chaotic. It could be very unproductive. It could be very destructive, very violent. You know, there's a lot of reason to believe that that's a possibility.
That's the danger, because the violence is so very, very, very destructive in its capability now, beyond anything historically we've known.
Yeah, well, look. Modern warfare is a technological process, right? So the thing you produce in war is death and destruction. The better the technology and the more advanced it is, the more death and the more destruction that a single person or group of people can produce. So the forward march of technology creates the possibility of making more wealth and a better world, and making more destruction, more death, more injury, and more savagery and sadness.
The Chinese have a saying, "Spare me from living an interesting time." That's shot to hell. This is the most interesting time.
It's an interesting time. Yeah, but especially if you have a show, it's good to be living an interesting time.